The internal context of bilingual processing. Part 1, the challenge. And my name's Mike Sherwood-Smith, talking to you from Edinburgh, and I'll be dealing with these 5 topics in the following way. First, we'll be looking at what I call the challenge for anyone interested in bilingual processing. And then the next talk will be about answering the challenge. Then as you see, we go on to assumptions and principles, and these are based on the Modular Cognition Framework, which I'll be talking about in a moment. And then we move on to its architecture, and finally I'll finish up with some examples. So that's the 5 topics in 5 separate talks. And now the way that this current presentation, today's presentation, will continue. After talking to you about the background, I will look at the idea that explanations can be relatively shallow or relatively deep, and whether you choose one or the other will have certain consequences for your research. Then I'm going to go into a role-playing mode, and I'm going to ask you in your role-playing capacity some challenging questions. These you may find provocative and even a little aggressive. I shall then switch roles, and I will try and defend myself against these challenging questions. And finally, I shall talk about how the Modular Cognition Framework can do a good job providing answers. So let's move straight on to the background. So this is me, Mike Sherwood-Smith, in Edinburgh. I began as an applied linguist. I moved into second language acquisition, which is a theoretical field rather than an applied one, and I was lucky enough to be there almost from the beginning as it developed, and later on I became interested in bilingualism in general, and this led naturally on to a general interest in cognitive science in the mind. With, of course, always the idea of how language might fit into the mind in general. With the same interests as me, John Truscott, who is an American in Taiwan, trained as a psychologist, although he did his PhD in generative linguistics. And we have been developing this framework since the year 2000. Well, these show the 4 books that have been produced so far, and in 2000 we were answering or trying to answer a very specific question about the language acquisition device, which is an idea put forward by psycholinguists at the time. This yielded an unsatisfactory result, and it led to us looking at language in general, and processing and representation, and we developed a way of tackling this, which produced ultimately in 2004 our very first publication, which is a keynote article in Bilingualism, Language and Cognition. This one was one that basically set out the idea of the framework, but it never got a comprehensive treatment until 2014, which is when our first book appeared in Cambridge University Press, called The Multilingual Mind. And this is, as I said, is the first comprehensive treatment of the framework, and ever since the framework has been developing. But the first 2 books that appeared were essentially spin-offs from the first book, and the first of these was John Truscott's book on consciousness, and the second language learner. Second language learning is an area where consciousness has featured as a topic right from the beginning, but I think this book's quite good even if you're not specifically interested in the second language acquisition, giving you a very good idea of the state of things in consciousness research in general. The second spin-off was my own, also in Cambridge University Press, called Mapping Mind and Language, and is intended to give a general introduction to the mind and the role of language in it, and was intended originally to be simply a textbook version of the first book, but some ideas are developed further, some commitments are made, as was the case with the first spin-off, but the latest book, The Internal Context of Bilingual Processing, which you immediately see is the very same topic as the one we'll be dealing with in these 5 talks. This came out in 2019 and marks a significant advance in the development of the framework. And this is the website. I don't know if you got onto this YouTube directly from the YouTube website, or whether you actually took it from our multilingual page, our multimedia page, I'm sorry. In this multimedia page you will find details of all the presentations that we have, and many of them are YouTube presentations. So now let's look at explanations. Explanations can be shallower or they can be deep. And by shallow I mean rather theory light. So you'll see lots and lots of studies which are focusing on a very specific hypothesis, not a theory, and they don't deal much with a theory. They very quickly spell out the hypothesis before going on to the research methodology they're going to use. And if that sounds a bit negative, if the word shallow has negative connotations, I want quickly to say it has distinct advantages. A shallow explanation type piece of research permits clearly defined limited research goals and outcomes. From an experimental point of view, you can control variables, so it really gets you going on a research project pretty quickly. And you can associate your small-scale project with your limited hypothesis with a line of thinking investigated in previous published studies, so you can have a sort of sense of an accumulation of studies in a particular area, hoping that accumulation of little explanations, of shallow explanations, might end up in a deeper, richer explanation. That would at least be your hope. And from a purely practical point of view, it promises a timely output of presentations. Just put me on the side there, to extend a CV. So in practical terms, researchers need to have a series of presentations, publications, and it's not so easy to do that when you're theorizing all the time. And finally, as I hinted earlier, there is always the possibility that even though your study has a very limited scope, explanation is, I would say, theory light, that this experimental study will in time contribute to deeper explanations. I put a question mark there, and I'll return to that because I have a little query about whether that will automatically be the case, that lots of shallow leads to deep. But diving into deep waters may be exciting, may be intellectually challenging, but it is not an easy thing to do. Deep waters are scary. It's really basically where we come in. there is help available, and in the form of the Modular Cognition Framework. Okay, so let's go into this role-playing mode that I mentioned. You're, say, a relatively young researcher. You've been doing some experimental research. I have read them with interest, and I have now some questions for you. Okay, so how do you explain this transition with respect to development of a language system through time? So LS here, that's language system, right? T is time. So here we have a language system at time 1, and it's been described by you and others with a specific group of people at a particular stage in their language development. They may be just people using a language in a natural way, or they may be sitting in a room learning it in a formal manner and classing themselves as actually language learners. But so you're looking at the kind of language system they are using in this relatively early stage in their development at time 1, and then at a particular time later, we called it time 2, you look again at the language system they're using, and you discover that there is a difference. There are a number of changes in this new language system. It is morphed into something else, and having completed the study, you are able to describe language systems at time 1 and language systems at time 2, and you can talk about the differences. You can describe what's the same, what's different, and then you can begin to hypothesize about why these changes have taken place. You may have some general ideas about, for example, another language that the language user has at his or her disposal, influencing it. You may have other things to say about the differences, but what you won't be able to answer yet, I suspect, is what are the actual mechanisms that drive this process in real time. After all, every millisecond of exposure to a language may potentially induce change. Sometimes there will be very little changes, sometimes there will be big changes. So please, can you give me an idea of how that works? Next question. That was a very long question, and I noticed that you didn't have much to say. So let's try this one, a more general one. How do you explain online processing? I mean, how do you think it works? I'll give you 3 minutes. Okay, right. So third question, working memory. In your when you're explaining your data, I noticed that you use the term working memory. So that's of course a familiar term to me. So I'm quite interested. Which theory of working memory have you chosen? And did you actually use it when you explained your data, or did you just refer to it as a background reference? Okay, next question. You also made reference to executive functions, or you might have said cognitive control, I can't remember which. But either way, can you explain what it actually means? 5 minutes? Okay. Maybe this is an easy one. Some of your studies contain the term mental lexicon. So, what exactly is it? How does it work? What's your view? What are your ideas about what a mental lexicon is? And if you may know more than one language, how can you have two lexicons in the same head, and how does that all work? Just give me a brief explanation in relatively few words. Well, okay. How about this? Explicit processing, right? So, what goes on in your head when you're doing something consciously, deliberately, intentionally. Simon, Stroop, flanker tasks. They're quite common in psycholinguistics and in bilingualism as well. If you use one of these tests, you have to sit your participants down and give them task instructions, don't you? You have to say, this is a test about whatever, and you have to indicate how they do the test. You have to press this button when you see this, or you'll see a screen and then there will be a sound and so on and so forth. So people who you're using as participants will go in and they will have specific goals in order to complete the task to your satisfaction. Now, since you're interested in subconscious processes, you may not want to give the game away. You may well hide the precise intention behind the experiment that you have, but you are giving them explicit instructions, and as they're doing the task, they're probably monitoring how they're doing it, checking that they're doing the right thing, and this is going to go alongside the subconscious processing that you are trying to tap into. So my question is, how does that explicit behaviour, that goal-driven behaviour, influence a task performance? Do you worry about it when you explain your data? Do you worry that this extra mode, explicit mode, will have had any influence? Okay, again, in my role-playing self, I'm actually quite nice, but I'm being quite nasty because I really think you are unable to explain to me from your behaviour during the questioning. You can't explain the mechanisms that cause development over time. You can't explain online processing very well. You don't seem to have a clear idea of what working memory is, how cognitive control works, about which theory of memory you prefer and why. And you don't really say much about the bilingual lexicon or any mental lexicon, as far nothing that I could really understand. So I'm really surprised, because all of these terms are rather crucial to understanding what exactly is going on and in your explanations of your data. So this really confuses me. I'm very sorry. Okay, so what would role-playing you say, apart from sort of walking out of the door and slamming it? Well, you might say, look, in the current academic world, there is an awful lot of publishing pressure, and okay, I think this really excuses my ignorance of available accounts. I simply don't have the time to read them and study them properly. You might say, well, hang on, thank you very much, I have indeed read around the subject, perhaps not as much as you would like, but I have got some idea of what's available, and as far as I can see, there aren't any fully fledged accounts of these phenomena anyway, so how on earth do you expect me to have them when the experts don't have them in the first place? Or you might say, okay, so maybe there are some accounts, but the ones that I've read at least are based on assumptions I have about the mind and about language that I'm disinclined to support. I mean, I'm a connectionist, and I don't like this cognitive stuff, or this. I particularly don't like generative linguistics. I'm sorry. Or you may, say the reverse. In other words, you can excuse yourself by saying, yes, you have tried to find out things outside your field and investigate these various concepts, but none of them really attract you for that reason. And indeed you might have a combination of any of those arguments in your defence. Okay, so dropping the role-playing mode now and coming back to reality, my impression at least is that beyond purely shallow explanations for many of these topics and concepts, there seems still to be a thick conceptual fog, and they are, after all, I think, vital concepts for the ultimate explanation of the phenomena that we're interested in. What are we going to do about it? Well, this brings me to our final section, which is on providing answers. And I can say straight away that the Modular Cognition Framework has very explicit responses to all of these questions. But before you think I'm getting megalomaniac, I'm going to sort of not impress you with being particularly foolish and arrogant. I'm not saying that the Modular Cognition Framework has responses that are explicit and all-encompassing. So how far might it get us? Well, if we conceive of a path between shallow explanations and deep explanations as a series of stepping stones, after all, it's not a dichotomy. Explanations aren't either shallow or deep. They are relatively shallow or relatively deep. Where does that get us? Well, I think I would put the Modular Cognition Framework bang in the middle. So certainly not supplying deep explanations straight off. And it's not a theory, after all. It is just a framework, so it's open-ended. But being theoretical, of course, it has certain theoretical commitments. And since it's open-ended and a framework and not a proper fully-fledged theory, it requires continuing input from all areas of cognitive science, and particularly from you, if you're a linguist of some kind, because we have to extend the framework into a deep explanation. So that brings us to the end. About 26 minutes has gone, and next time I'll be answering the challenge, or trying to do so. So we'll get down to brass tacks, as they say. We'll get down to details next time, and I hope that you will join me. And if you haven't already done so, you may also be interested in the Modelling the Mind series, which is a fairly simple view of the mind in general from the point of view of the Modular Cognition Framework. And until then, we'll stop there.